Welcome to Life in the Bricks podcast, where we talk to real people about programs that enhance our community so that we can build bigger and better portfolios while providing options for our residents to achieve self-sufficiency. I'm your host, Tony McGinnis, Executive Director, CEO with the Huntsville Housing Authority. All right. Welcome to Life in the Bricks podcast. Today, I'm excited to have an individual on the show that is our Deputy Executive Director who has a ton of experience in housing and is a former public housing resident. So I don't think we've had a chance to really do this and introduce her to the community, but I'm excited to have on the show Miss Turkessa Coleman Lacey. Turkessa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Mr. McGinnis, and thank you for having me on your show. Matter of fact, this is, I've done several speaking engagements, but this is actually my first podcast. So thank you.
Awesome. So we're going to jump right into it. And because you are a former public housing resident, I want to start out by asking you this question. Can you share your personal experience of living in public housing and how that has shaped your life as an adult?
So yes, that's a loaded question. So let me start here. As I scale through your questions, you made me think. You made me pull back some layers and really remember those days in public housing. But I like to start here. So I have the honor, most definitely the honor, of serving in the role of Deputy Director for the Huntsville Housing Authority. I hold a bachelor's degree of science in computer science with a minor in mathematics. From Talladega College, I hold a master's degree in computer science, a master's degree in urban planning from A&M with a concentration of housing and community development. My expertise is in city and community development planning through preparing municipalities with HUD consolidated plans, annual plans, fair housing plans, and the list goes on. And I've spent over 20 years in housing development and sustainability. I have some experience in grant management and oversight in CDBG, emergency solution grants, and home investment partnership programs. Currently, I'm responsible for the operations and administration of public housing, HCV, real estate development, Section 3, workforce development. And some of my professional and civic affiliations include the American Planning Association, Delta Sigma Theta, the League of Women Voters, Madison County Lawyers Volunteer Program, LICA, which is the state board. I'm married to Mr. Carl Lacey, which is a native of Huntsville. We share 3 children and 5 grandchildren together. But I said all that, Tony, to say that none of that could have been achieved if it wasn't for the foundation that I got from public housing and that community itself. That community yield a space where your neighbors, my family members, were true missionaries, were teachers, were mechanics, were painters, business owners, community advocates, and beyond. And even my mother, she had the opportunity to serve in the United States Army. Again, I'm saying those things, to set some type of framework to say that I couldn't get those attributes if it wasn't for the community coming together to raise me. And that community was public housing. Although my mother was a single parent, she was intentional in making sure that myself and my 2 brothers stayed above the fray. And so as we go through the rest of this podcast, I want to talk about public housing in a sense of community versus what doesn't exist, or versus, what we hear very often are sometimes the bad things that happen within community, within public housing. So I really want to focus on the community aspect of it, um, and how it shaped me. And so with that being said, those things could not have happened again if it wasn't for that framework, that foundation of a loving community that was public housing.
Man, that was awesome. The reason that's so important is because everybody that we've had on the show talked about the public housing community that they had growing up. And I think sometimes now people get that twisted. You have people who think that they're teaching us how to do community. Well, the one thing that we've always known how to do is community. We had people who looked out for us, who cared for us, who loved on us, and they necessarily was not our biological parents or blood relatives. They were people in the community that we call family. And so I'm glad you shared that, because most people that we've had on this show who talked about that, that's one of the things that they talk about. So I definitely can appreciate that. And so the next question is kind of very similar to that. What were some of the biggest challenges you faced living in public housing, and how were you able to overcome those challenges?
So for me, I think the biggest challenge was the perception, right? And in most cases, you could be the smartest person in your class, but however, the perception of living and being raised in public housing was looked at as a negative. And so, one of the things I think I did in order to overcome that was to just be the best at what be the best. That was the thing that my mother preached. That was the thing that my grandmother preached. That was the thing that the community preached. And it was required of us. If you set out to do something, if you set out to achieve a goal, then do that, work towards that. And so, and even now, as the deputy, it is still wrapped up in how the community as a whole view public housing and public housing residents. So that's the thing that I think that we need to continue to work on, changing the mindset of the masses. And you do that just by simply doing the work, simply making sure that you connect with your residents, with your HCV participants, understanding what their thoughts and ideas are, so we can get past this perceived notion that just because you're from public housing, that makes you less than.
So what you're essentially saying is that you overcome that perception by doing exactly what we're doing. You have the executive director and the deputy director, both who come from public housing and are end products of what we are fighting for. And so a lot of people need to be able to appreciate that. You got two people right here who grew up in public housing and now run the agency. And so I just think that's so important. And this is another question that I want to talk about that kind of goes back to that first one, is the impact of the sense of community, and how that how you felt, how you built community, and the relationships you built, and how those relationships continue to go on for years after years after years. Talk about that for a little bit.
Most definitely. So this is where it hits home for me, because um, the positive aspects is just what that is. It's the support systems that exist in public housing and the support systems that we create during our tenure in public housing. And as I thought about this question, I thought about folks like my great aunt, um, Miss Goldie Swain. She was, like, in every community, you have a candy lady, you have an icy lady. She was the candy and icy lady and made the best apple pies, fried apple pies in the world. I think about people like Miss Dars and Ricky Green. Mr. Ricky Green, dad of one of my best friends, but he was the maintenance super at the housing authority. I think about Mr. and Mrs. Louise and Denny Boy Duncan, another set of parents from one of my good friends, Connie. And they were huge community advocates. Matter of fact, there's even a park in the community that's named after him. I think about Miss and Mrs. Frank Curry. They were the namesakes of the Boys and Girls Club, which we had no choice but to go to every single day. And then I think about folks like Miss Turner. She owned a restaurant within the community that my mother sometimes worked for, and also worked for uh, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Curry, which owned a store there in the public housing development as well. And outside of her primary job, she was able to work at those two places just to get a few extra dollars. I think about Mr. Tommy Lee. Mr. Tommy Lee was, we called him the guard dog. If we were doing something within the neighborhood that we shouldn't have been doing, or we were somewhere in the neighborhood where we shouldn't be, that news made it back to my mother before we got back home. I think about my mother's really good friends, Miss Evelyn Patterson and Miss Helen and Miss Spencer, Miss Reynolds, and the list goes on and on. But the ability to be able to travel through your development, your community, and see folks sitting on the porch and um, getting after you when you were out of line in some sorts. So, a community really starts with people, and that's just basic. It starts with communicating with your neighbors. It starts with helping your neighbors. And that's how community is formed. It's not formed by bricks and mortars or, you know, those other indicators that sometimes happen that may not be so good in our community. It starts with people. And then even beyond that, I think about, like I mentioned a minute ago, having to go to the Boys and Girls Club every day. And I guess the word isn't having, but just looking forward to going to the Boys and Girls Club every day because you knew that was a safe space. And the summer times, participating in NYSP. If you guys, I'm probably dating myself on that. If you all remember NYSP, Upward Bound, and then how that transitioned to summer programs like NIH, which was the National Institute of Health, and then even further than that, participating in the Ronald McNair program as we start to get a little bit older. Um, so again, those positive aspects were completely formed around the support systems and the people that created and really care for you within those support systems.
Now, you talked about a lot of positive aspects and support systems, and which was really a part of the next question I was going to ask you. But when you look back at your life and what you were able to overcome, is there one particular place that you felt like had a greater influence on who you are today, and what would that place be?
That's a good one too. And it's hard to really kind of it's hard to name one place within the community because it literally was the entire community. And one thing I will share, Tony, was when we were growing up in public housing, what I remember most is having the ability to feel free. And let me explain. So at any given day, myself and my two brothers, we could start on one side of the development, visiting a friend, my friend Stacy, and we could end up on the other side of the development, visiting another friend, which is Connie. and we're on our bikes, and in between visiting them on one end of the development versus the other, you got the opportunity to stop at Mr. Chat's store. Mr. Chat was a blind man, and he had a store in the community. And we were able to spend a lot of time at that store buying penny candy, penny cookies, those type of things. And in between, you're able to experience um, playing softball or watching a softball game or watching football games. All of that went on in our community, and you were able to experience that from one end of the development to the other. And on top of that, finding areas where we can play around in the water, catching tadpoles and those type of things. So for me, I think being able to move about in the community and feel a sense of protection and feel a sense that people loved you because they expressed that through speaking, through fussing at us when it was time to do that. And so we it was just so many activities that you could participate in a day's time that wasn't necessarily wrapped around negative thoughts or negative things.
You sure you didn't grow up in Mason Court, Spartan Homes? Because I'm telling you, some of the stuff that you're talking about is the very thing that we did. And so I tell people all the time, man, this is a universal story. People take care of their children's. Children had a great time. Everybody had a store in their neighborhood. And, not to make light of the situation, we had a blind man who owned a store in our neighborhood as well. And we definitely, you had $1 back in the day, boy, you had those penny cookies, that penny candy. You can go to the store and just rack up. And you think about that today. I was telling somebody, we did a lot of things in the neighborhood that we probably shouldn't have done that wouldn't be safe today. You got kids going to the store, buying cigarettes or whatever for people, the old lady next door, or buying stuff and, hey, give me this and you can have the change. And I used to love going to the store and people tell me I can get the change because that meant something. That means I can get me something, whereas my mom might not have been able to afford me that. So it's good to hear that your story is my story and the story of other people who've been on the show, man. Everybody's stories match up. And again, it just shows the importance of community. And it really brings back home to me that nobody can show us how to do community because we've been doing community for years and it was real. We got to get back to that. We got to get back to how we can communicate to people how to do family, how to do community, because that was so important. And so the next question is, man, you talked about it earlier, but what are some of the misconceptions or stereotypes you think people have about public housing residents? And how do you particularly address those stereotypes?
So the biggest stereotype is, for me, is the misconception that public housing residents do not work. Every time I hear that statement or I hear some language that alludes to that, I mean, it burns me because I know for sure firsthand that that is not the truth. One, from growing up in public housing and now specifically in my role now with the housing authority. And so for me, in order to dispel that myth, I think that we have to constantly share real stories in real time. Telling the stories of public housing residents can most definitely help dispel those stereotypes. Educating others. That's you and I do that every day, all day. Is to make sure that we're educating the community as a whole about what jobs our residents work and how we are always continuing trying to make sure that we connect our residents to the most appropriate jobs. They're skilled folks, just like everyone else, and so we want to make sure that we introduce them to the jobs that are for them. Another way I think that we can dispel the misconception is by listening to our residents. Um, Again, that allows them to share their skill sets, which leverage their power. Always, we need to share counter narrative. So when someone makes the statement that public housing residents don't work, it is our job to provide a sharing counter narrative. And then lastly is recognizing the right to affordable housing. I think that's where we miss out on the linkage. So we talk about for affordable housing, we talk about the need of it, but recognizing it as a right, and really polling our state constitutional powers that be to somehow figure out how to establish public housing and affordable housing as a right for low to moderate income people.
Man, that's rich. That's powerful. That's definitely powerful. So, how has your experience living in public housing impacted your well, had an influence on your perspective on housing inequality and homelessness in the community now? You know, although we lived in public housing, we had a roof over our head. How do you look at that population and the impact it's having right now?
Yeah. Um, yeah. So, Tony, one of the reasons why I became an urban planner, I didn't intend to. I will say that. Um, when I graduated from undergrad, my first job was software engineering. You know, the idea was to make a lot of money. And I think that's all of our thoughts. When I was a senior, I sat with my counselor. We looked through, back then, we used to have to look through a book and view all of the jobs in one column, and then it kind of correlated with what that salary would be. And so I can remember saying to, me and myself and my counselor talking back and forth, and she says, Turkessa, you're really good in math. You should pick something with math. And so I chose computer science. However, as a software engineer, it just did not give me that social aspect that I needed. And I thought, man, I don't know if I'll be able to sit in a cubicle for 30 years and just code. And so on campus, on A&M's campus one day, and I saw a notice that read Urban Planning Fellowship. So I said, well, let's try it. And I was able to get that fellowship. And that really was the thing that transformed my thoughts about how to merge my technical side of computer science with an actual social aspect, which was urban planning. And so as a planner, when considering housing inequality and homelessness, it is a cross sector of figuring out how to develop and implement sound housing strategies. Um, we see the influx of homelessness in our community, and it's in the masses. But on top of that, we also see the limited amount of affordable and attainable housing, one and the same. And so I think if we ever figure out that piece, we'll probably be very wealthy people if we figure out how to eliminate homelessness. But I want to offer this. As a planner, I think in order to completely grasp those two things, which is homelessness and not enough affordable housing, is to make sure that we hold our administration accountable to figuring out how to create transparent processes around those two things, which is homelessness and affordable housing. Create thicker community dialogue around those two things, and really ensuring that the community input is considered through those processes. So, we can bounce around the number of homelessness and the number of affordable housing that we need. But I think it starts with everybody that is responsible for decision making to be completely open and not afraid to talk about those two things, which is homelessness and affordable housing, and figure out the cross sector between the two. Um, I've been able to spend 20 years, a lot of that with community development with the city of Huntsville, talking just about these two things. I will say that around the conversations have grown, and I think that's by um, just the shift of the universe. And so now it's time to take those conversations, be transparent with those, create more dialogue, and create more community input so we can best understand how to plan for those two sectors.
So that leads into the next question for me. Then, we talk about holding. That's really holding people accountable, but from a position of a former resident and now as a somebody out here on the front line serving, what changes or improvements do you think we need to make in public housing policies, so that we can grow residents and get more people out? What can we do?
Sure. So I think the first thing that we can always do is advocate. So you and I have had the luxury, and I will say luxury because it has been, to be a part of the FOTA community, which allows us the opportunity to see how policy is made from the top down. And so if I had a magic wand and I could change any policy, it'll be in the areas of, it'll be in four areas. One, it'll be upfront renovation funding. Um, Sometimes HUD provides us not with 100% funding, but expect for us to maintain old, dated um, units. We have units that's still on deck that were built in 1952, and it's probably some that was built even beyond that. So that would be the first policy issue that I would tackle: upfront renovation funding for the units that are still existing. The second policy change that I would advocate for is the increase of subsidies that comes with that upfront renovation funding. Um, as you know, we operate, and we do a very good job with operating on a shoestring budget. Um, and so to be able to increase the subsidies would most definitely help us. And the third thing for me would be to improve the conversations or policies around the Section 8 program, and allowing housing authorities to assist our landlords that are participating in the programs to rehab their properties, and things of that nature. And then the fourth thing for me is to ensure that the coordination of agencies happens in a streamlined manner. So, you have HUD CPD, and then you have HUD Public and Indian Housing. To be able to create some policies around better cross training between those two entities at a policy level, I think would also really, really help us figure out how to move people forward to self sufficiency. So, again, for me, that policy change will be to increase the upfront renovation funding, adequate subsidies, increase that subsidy funding, improve Section 8 options, and be able to help landlords with home improvements, because, they're gracious to be able to be willing, I should say, to be willing to participate in our program. And then the last thing is to be able to do some cross sector training and communication, create some level of communication between the two HUD entities, that would allow us to be able to communicate and coordinate better amongst those agencies.
Man, that's strong. That's powerful. I tell you, that would make a tremendous impact immediately, and I appreciate you sharing that. And I know you've been involved in a lot of advocacy, community initiatives related to affordable housing and public housing reform. You know, not only as a person out on the grassroots level since leaving public housing. Can you just talk about some of those programs or groups that you're affiliated with right now?
Sure, sure, no, most definitely. So again, like I mentioned a few times, I've spent my last 20 years advocating for affordable and attainable housing. And through that, I've I've had the honor of serving on many boards, but currently I serve on NATCH, the North Alabama Coalition for the Homeless Board. Been on that board for some time. I also serve on LICA, that is LIHCA, which is a low income housing coalition board of Alabama, and that is comprised of folks throughout the state of Alabama. I'm also a part of the city sponsor affordable housing group. Both you and I are. I'm also a board member for the Madison County Lawyers Program. So, which is a very special position on that board, because sometimes what happens is folks are they can't access affordable housing because of some legal things, and those legal things are sometimes very basic. A ticket that went unpaid, or which won't allow, which hurts their credit, or expungements that need to happen in order for them to do that. So it's a lot of legal things, and they're very simple. That's keeping folks from accessing affordable housing. And then, of course, the committees that you and I are part of through FATA. You know, those are always exciting. You're able to hear policy, rules, and regulations from top down. So those are the few that stands out immediately.
So this final question would be: what message or advice would you like to share with policymakers, advocates, and the public to help them better understand the realities of public housing and the residents that we serve?
Whew. Now that's a loaded one, right? Um, I think I would say to specifically decision makers is to don't be afraid of the affordable housing conversation, which includes public housing. Um, we are just like everyone else in our community. We're not asking for a handout. What we're asking for is to be included in some of the conversations around affordable housing and what it should look like. And so that statement goes to everyone in our community, policymakers, advocates, um, to the public, the masses is where I want to go with that. Is to It is time now to finally have those very much needed conversations around public housing, because when your city, your county, your state starts to grow, there is going to be a higher need for affordability. There's going to be a higher need for conversations around homelessness. So before we burst out the seams, the best thing to do now is to be able to have those solid conversations and put some things in place that are benchmarks in place that are truly attainable. And you and I talk about this all of the time. It seems as if sometimes our community expects for the housing authority to take care of this whole idea of affordability. And most definitely, if we could, I think we will most definitely do that. But we can't do it on our own. Just like some of your nonprofits that are in place that work with our residents, they can't do it on their own. So this is the time to connect and talk about things like that we talk about through LICA is creating a housing trust fund. We want to do that throughout the state, but most definitely it will be ideal to be able to do something like that at the local level. And from that housing trust fund, to be able to really set aside funding to do things like a choice neighborhood initiative that we're currently in. By the way, I love that model. Congratulations again to you for taking us through that process of being able to get the CNI grant and being able to move forward with the city and other entities to get that done. But I think creating policies around a housing trust fund, creating policies around the CNI model is are the things that will be able to help the public understand the realities of public housing residents and how we most definitely fit in that core as it relates to what affordability looks like and what public housing looks like. I think sometimes our policymakers or even our community, we think about public housing in its traditional form. And just like the title of your podcast is labeled, the bricks, we look at it, they look at it as the bricks or less than. However, public housing is changing drastically. And we want to be a part of that uptick of the drastic changes for public housing because I feel like if we don't at this point, then we're going to lose a sector of our population to street homelessness if we're not careful. And if we don't make those necessary policies to be able to advocate for affordable housing and public housing.
Man, thank you again. The nuggets that you were able to share were very, very rich. Looking forward to everything that we're going to continue to do at this agency. It's been a joy having you on the team and just bringing your knowledge from community development over to the housing authority has been great. You know, we don't do a lot to advocate ourselves as a part of what we do because we do a lot of work behind the scene that nobody else will ever know. But it's been good having Turkessa on this team because of her knowledge of community and especially community development and planning. Because, as a housing authority, sometimes we sit in silos and we think we don't have to connect. And what we've been able to do in a short period of time has been great. And, you congratulated me on the CNI, but I know that even when you were at community development, you all really initiated that. And so we appreciate the work that you did on CNI before you even came to the housing authority. So we appreciate it. And we appreciate you sharing your stories too, because again, when people see that resident who might not be as polished right now, I assure you that this is what investment and community and relationship can do for a resident. They can go and run community development. They can come back and run organization. They can join boards across the country and across the state. They can do all those things, but it take a strong commitment and an investment into the person. And oftentimes we don't see people. We just see numbers, and we think everybody wants to be in the situation that they're in. So I appreciate all the rich nuggets that you shared today. And I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to do this, because I feel like this is a part of the work. Oftentimes people don't necessarily get to see, but what'll happen is there'll be people all across the country that will see this. They'll be able to understand a little bit more because we're trying to shed light and knowledge to a world that doesn't know our world. So again, we appreciate you. We appreciate all you do. And this concludes our episode. Please share this on all your social media links. We want to get this word out there. The more we can educate our community, this is one of the ways that we do that, by having real conversations with real people so that we can get this message out there about public housing. You know, it's so many layers, and we're learning as we go. And there's so many layers to this. So we appreciate everybody who will listen to this. And if you have any comments, reach out. Again, this concludes our episode of Life in the Bricks. We hope you enjoy. We've come to the end of the podcast today. Please share the link on all your social media platforms. We hope that you all will join us again next time. Until then, keep serving and keep pushing. This has been another amazing episode of Life in the Bricks podcast. Peace.